Welcome to the Virginia Science Technology Campus. Uh, this is the first of a series of talks we will have over the next few years, or as long as GW will keep me. Uh, we thought that, is this working? All right. It's working. All right. Sound check. Okay, now it's working. Um, so the idea behind the series is that we are sitting in the nation's capital, where the intellectual capital is the richest in the nation and perhaps in the world. And given the quality of our faculty, students, staff, uh, and others who are associated with the university, either via visiting or research professorships, we could actually create a dialogue between major figures in the nation and our own faculty and staff and researchers and students, and address some of the most important problems that the globe faces, because now all the problems are global, and we happen to be interested in some of those global problems. So here we are, and I searched in my memory bank to find out whom I could find with the right kinds of qualifications to be our inaugural speaker. And it didn't take me long to come up with the name of Dr. Parney Albright, who has had a distinguished career as a scientist who has advised the president and notable figures in the government and the nation, and has played a major role in some of our policies. After graduating, he went and joined the Institute for Defense Analysis, where he developed a reputation for being an expert in ballistic and cruise missiles. I could have told you that when he was taking junior level classes with me at GW. He always had an interest in looking at the larger problems and the applications of the scientific principles to other problems, applied problems. And from then on, his career took off. He has served the president in the Office of Science and Technology Policy. That's the president of the United States. Worked with Jack Marburger there. Then he was Assistant Secretary in the Homeland Security Department, 2003. As of 2009, he has been in charge of the Lawrence Livermore National Lab, which, as you know, is one of the premier and important laboratories that addresses national security in the nation. I had the privilege of having classes with him, courses with him, when we were undergraduate students, and we got to know each other. And he was kind enough to accept my invitation to come, and so I'm grateful for that. I think we are in for a wonderful evening as the inaugural talk of this series. I would be remiss if I didn't recognize some of the figures here. I know most of you, but I'm not going to name everybody. I just wanted to recognize members of the Board of Trustees who are here. Trustee Mark Hughes, who's himself an alum, and Trustee B.J. Penn, former Secretary of Navy, who's joined us. And I can just name all the distinguished people who are sitting here, but I think I'll forego that. It's better to hear from Parney. I would also be remiss if I didn't say that both he and I are nervous, because one of our professors here, from whom we learned a lot of physics and whom we were afraid of, not because of his grading policies, but because the sheer force of his intellect is here with us, and that's Professor Park, who is just recently Professor Emeritus of the University in Physics Department. So thank you, Bill, for coming. And I would also like to thank all the people who helped us to organize this, people from my office and from the External Relations, who helped tremendously with this event. Paula Harper, Andrea Barnes, Dova Wilson, Jenny Moline, and Latarsha Gatlin. So thank you very much, all of you, and the other members of the staff who have been instrumental in putting the series in place. We will have other notable events in the coming semester, but I am just delighted that Parney accepted this invitation to be our inaugural speaker. Thank you, and let's give him a big applause.
So does this work? The mic working? Okay, good. So first, thanks very much for inviting me. I actually, when Ali called, how could I say no? I was an undergraduate here at GW, and in fact, I was just talking to the chairman of the physics department. I can't imagine any better preparation I had for graduate school and then for my future career than the undergraduate education I got here at GW. So it was really fabulous. So it was funny, Ali, this is the title of the talk, and Ali said, well, you must have given this talk 1,000 times. I've actually never given this talk. and the reason is because I spend a lot of time, I can certainly talk a lot about Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. I can speak in depth about Livermore. And actually, you're going to hear me speak a lot about Livermore because when we talk about specific examples, that's where I feel the most comfortable. But what I really wanted to talk about was sort of the broader picture of the role of national laboratories in national security. And so I'm in a bit of an uncomfortable situation of having to talk about my sister labs at Sandia and Los Alamos. For those of you who know the complex, the nuclear weapons complex and the National Lab complex, that is we have it's called collaborative competition. So it's, whatever that means. More competition, well, I shouldn't say it that way. And so anyway, I'm gonna try to weave that into the conversation. I've never tried to do that before, so bear with me. The other thing is that I'm actually gonna talk about the national laboratories. So what do we mean by national laboratories? So we could mean a lot of things. We could mean, for example, the entire enterprise of federally funded research laboratories in the country, right? So that would include things like Naval Research Laboratory, Army Research Lab, Lincoln Lab, Oak Ridge, and as well as the 3 NNSA laboratories. But we all actually have very, very different missions, and we're actually constructed in different ways. So, for example, almost all of the DoD laboratories are federal employees. On the Department of Energy side, essentially nobody is a federal employee. Okay, we're federally funded research and development centers. And then within the Department of Energy, you have laboratories that serve the Office of Science. And so even though they do a lot of national security work, if you work at one of those laboratories, if you work at Oak Ridge, for example, or Pacific Northwest Laboratory, the question you will get asked when you're initiating a project is, what is your science agenda? Okay? And that's appropriate because they're Office of Science laboratories. Okay? There are applied energy laboratories. Idaho National Laboratory, for example, supports the part of the Department of Energy that does the nuclear energy mission. And so they are very focused on that space. They do national security work. They do cyber, in fact, they're pretty big in cybersecurity, for example. But nevertheless, their mission space is nuclear energy. So what I'm really going to talk about today are the 3 national nuclear administration laboratories, Sandia, Los Alamos, and Livermore. Because we actually, first of all, we're bigger than everybody else by a lot. And secondly, we have a very focused mission, which is really national security. So I'll say more about that in a moment. So really, let's see if this works. Cool, okay. So let's talk about who we are. So the first is that we are multi-sponsored, federally funded research and development centers, and we're funded by NNSA, the National Nuclear Security Administration, which, for those of you who don't know, sits in the Department of Energy. By the way, NNSA is about 2/3 of DOE's budget. It's about 100% of the risk. If you pick up the newspaper, right, it's usually some screw up at one of the labs. Never mind, by the way. So what are we all about? Well, first of all, we are all about responding to the needs of the nation. So as federally funded research and development centers, we are not for-profit organizations. The whole reason we exist is to serve the national need. And the people who come to work at these laboratories come to work at the laboratories because they want to serve the national interest. If you want to get rich, I can tell you this is not the place to come. Okay? We also anticipate the future. So a big part of what we do as federally funded research and development centers, we exist in large part to, as we said, we exist to serve the nation, we exist to respond to the needs of the nation, which means that often we have to get in front of those needs. We have to make investments to be prepared to answer questions that we think we're going to get in 3 years, 5 years, or 10 years. Okay? So as an example, at my laboratory, I'm about a $1.6 billion laboratory. I have about $160 million a year of internal research and development capacity at the lab that I can invest. And we spend a great deal of time thinking about what are the things we need to be prepared to do so when the government calls upon us to work these kinds of issues, we will be ready to respond. And actually, that's a big part of my job. My job as laboratory director is, again, to make sure that this laboratory is able to fulfill its mission, which is to respond to those needs. And then finally, we're all about delivering solutions, right? So all three of these laboratories, we do cutting edge science. Absolutely cutting edge. But we deliver solutions. So as you'll see in a little bit, the biggest component of my staff at Livermore is engineers. And what they are all about is, at the end of the day, when we produce something, when someone the user pushes the button, they expect the light to come on, right? It's got to work. And so even though we are deploying, as I said, cutting edge science in many, many cases, we're really at the forefront. At the end of the day, someone expects the software we deliver to work, or the device we deliver to actually do what we said it was going to do, okay? So that's what that's all about. We are trusted partners with our sponsors. That means that we are free of conflicts of interest. Again, we're not a for-profit organization, so that means, for example, that if someone comes to us and asks us to evaluate a particular weapon system, which happens sometimes, it's not like I have to go back to a board and say, geez, if I tell the Air Force the bad news, is that going to screw me up, for my next contract competition? We have to be trusted. We have to be trusted agents, objective, and of course technically excellent. And what we do is we provide enduring focus on enduring issues of national security. Now, the most important enduring issue of national security that these three laboratories operate in is in the nuclear weapons mission. I'll say more about that later. But actually, we spend also a lot of our time, since we actually have a much broader national security mission, we spend a lot of our time embedding our people and their people at our laboratory. And we send people to other agencies, to the Department of Defense, to the Air Force, to the Navy, places like that, because you have to understand their operational problems. Again, we are not about raising the general level of science. We do that all the time because we just have the people who can do that. But we are really about delivering capability. And what does that mean? It means the capability that somebody needs. It is useless to develop a capability that nobody needs. Happens all the time, by the way, but it doesn't do anybody any good. So we have to understand, the constraints, the operational issues, whatever that exists within the intelligence community, Department of Defense, Department of Navy, various agencies, so that when we deliver solutions and we know, as I said, when they push the button and the red light comes on, we know that actually what they wanted to have happen, right? Or another way to say that is we don't want to be sharpening the wrong end of the stick, which is another way to say that, okay? And then the other thing we bring to the table is scale. So, my laboratory of the three laboratories is the smallest. It's 1.6 billion, but that's still pretty big. And so where most agencies, if you go to Naval Research Laboratory, for example, which is a very, very fine laboratory, they might be 1 or 2 people deep in areas that I have 50 people, right? So I have critical mass, and I also have capability, which we'll talk a little bit about in a minute, that I can bring to bear on problems simply because of that scale, right? So, and I'll say a lot more about the multidisciplinary piece of this in a moment, because it's really important to what we do. And then, as I said, we invest in the future very much. We anticipate solutions. So let me talk about our mission. So this is right out of our contract. This is right out of the Lawrence Livermore contract. By the way, you will notice in this contract that the word nuclear is not in it. We didn't write this, DOE wrote this, just so you know, right? Now, I will tell you, if you kept on reading the statement of work down here, all the stuff that goes behind it, believe me, they talk about nuclear a lot. But nevertheless, this is our prime mission statement, okay? And actually, I think George Shultz, I was in a meeting with George Shultz, former Secretary of State, about, 6 months ago, and it was myself and the other two lab directors were in the room, and he actually put it very, very succinctly. He said, your mission is to make the nation safer. And that's how we see our job. It's really about making the nation safer. So here are the 3 labs. Let's see, Los Alamos is the oldest of the laboratories. It was founded by Oppenheimer and Groves. It's about 2.2 billion. It was founded actually as an actual laboratory, I think in 42. Does anybody know? 42 sounds right. And Sandia Laboratory with Oppenheimer and Hartley Rowe, I believe his name was, who was the first. So with these 2 laboratories were the initial laboratories. They were set up. So this was the Nuclear Weapons Laboratory, the Manhattan Project. And so after the Second World War, they were engaged in weapons development, right, nuclear weapons development. It became pretty clear that a big part of nuclear weapons development was the non-nuclear componentry, the fuses, the guidance system, all the things that go with that. So Sandia Lab was actually spun off by Oppenheimer into a separate laboratory. These guys sit in Los Alamos, New Mexico. These guys sit in Albuquerque. And their culture is, every laboratory has a culture that's kind of reflective of their founders, okay? So Los Alamos was founded by Oppenheimer. It actually has a very academic organization chart. Actually, it's partly driven by the geography of the place. So if you go to Los Alamos, it's actually, we call it the high mesa, but it's really high mesas, right? There's a whole bunch of mesas where different parts of the laboratory sit. And actually, to get to one from one place, it's 40 square miles. And to get from one place to the other, you actually have to drive off the site in many cases, right? So they're very much organized along academic lines. There's kind of a physics division and a chemistry division and an explosives division and that sort of thing. And they're organized that way, and it's proved to be a very successful model for them. Sandia, of course, is very much organized along engineering, it's sort of systems engineering lines, right? And they sit on a site that's actually fairly compact, but again, their culture is all about engineering. Actually, if you go to Sandia, you will certainly find physicists and mathematicians and computer scientists there. Believe me, they have them. They have very good ones there. But it is mainly an engineering laboratory. Livermore was actually the last lab founded. It was founded in 1952, and it was founded in part because of the view that the Air Force and the national leadership had that there was a need for what was called a new ideas lab. There was a concern about the pace of development of thermonuclear weapons. Okay, so these are multi-stage weapons, and so that was founded by initially by Ernest Lawrence and Edward Teller out at an old naval air base that had been abandoned at the end of World War II. By the way, I still have buildings with people in them from that era. Actually, that's a problem to see. So at Livermore, as an example, we actually sit on 1 square mile. And this is actually reflective of the culture that Lawrence and Teller brought to the table. Lawrence, of course, was famous. He won the Nobel Prize for the development of the cyclotron. And Lawrence was a big believer in big multidisciplinary science applied to big problems. But the key point was multidisciplinary. And Lawrence was all about this idea that if you brought physicists and chemists, and now to ratchet forward to modern era, computer scientists and biological scientists, and you had them all sort of squished together into a square mile, which is what we are, that you would create this ineffably innovative environment where people with different problem-solving paradigms would collect together and address problems in a very multidisciplinary way, in a very creative way. And that's turned out to be true. There's actually only 2 cafeterias on this site. So, by the way, if you ever come to Livermore, those of you who've ever, who here has been to Livermore? Just out of curiosity. 1, 2, 3, 4, about half a dozen people here. If you ever come onto the site, one of the things that will strike you right away is that there are bicycles everywhere. We buy bicycles for our staff. Well, we don't buy them for the staff, we buy them for the site. And it's kind of a thing there where you just basically, if you find a bicycle, you can hop on it and then go ride to another part of the lab, okay? And, you know, again, it's this, and I will tell you, one of the things that struck me when I came there 3 years ago was that everybody knows everybody else. Everybody knows everybody else. So it really creates an environment where you can really address some of the nation's most difficult problems in a very, very multidisciplinary way. And that's reinforced by the mix of our people. And I will tell you that if I went to Los Alamos, you would see something kind of like this. Sandia would look nothing like this, okay? But you know, most people think of Livermore and Los Alamos as the physics labs, right? And the reason we're called the physics labs is because in the nuclear weapons program, we're responsible for what is euphemistically called the physics package. Okay, well that's the thing that goes boom. And I will tell you though that that's actually only a small, I mean that's the most important part. I mean if you went to Sandia you might get a different answer, but I say it's the most important part of the weapon. Sandia of course are the ones who make all the firing mechanisms and the fuses and that sort of thing, right? But what's interesting about this is, as I said earlier, is that most of my staff are engineers. I have a lot of physicists, but I got actually a lot of computer scientists. And in fact, one point, sort of a recurring theme of what I'm going to say later is that computing is kind of, I mean, one of my colleagues calls it the intellectual electricity of the laboratory. We treat computing at the laboratory in much the same way that you treat, if you're a chemist, the gas supply or the water supply in your laboratory. It is ubiquitous and it is everywhere. And it is hard to find a project at our laboratory, particularly on one of the hard problems, which does not heavily involve, you know, simulation modeling and high-performance computing of one kind or another. And I'll come back to that. I'll point out the other, because we have political scientists at the laboratory. I have a very, very large intelligence program, about $140 million a year intelligence program at the laboratory, okay? And a big chunk of that is analysis. And my laboratory, along with Sandia and Los Alamos, are pretty well known as places you go to for country studies. And this was actually pioneered at Livermore in the 50s. So we are special, and so the way we apply this is we do whole country studies. So our job is to understand, for example, the nuclear weapons capabilities of, you pick a country, okay? And we bring to the table not just an understanding of the technical issues that they are confronting, but actually their leadership, who makes the decisions, what their backgrounds are, what their strategies are, how they think they can win a war. All those things come to the table in these analyses, and they are believe me, at least in the areas that we operate in, which are mainly weapons of mass destruction, we, along with Los Alamos in particular, and to a lesser degree Sandia, are the leading purveyors of that information. But the point is I got a bunch of political scientists at the lab, and they seem to be happy, although they sometimes don't work well with these guys. But anyway, by the way, also we have quite a few biological scientists at the laboratory too, and I'll say more about that later as well. We actually have a very big bio program at the laboratory, and I'll say why later. So what is our core mission? Our core mission is the Stockpile Stewardship Program. And this is true for all three laboratories. What is that? So in 1992, the United States made a decision to stop underground nuclear testing. We have not had a test for yield in this country since for 20 years. Okay. Nevertheless, we have nuclear weapons, and we have to make sure that they work. And not only do we have to make sure that they work, by the way, these weapons were generally designed for lifetimes of maybe 10 to 15 years, okay? Because the way things worked prior to 92, right in the middle of the Cold War, is there was this constant cycle of new weapons platforms, new missiles, MX, Poseidon, you name it, B-2 bombers, whatever, and they would get a new warhead, and then there would be a refresh every few years, and a new warhead would get designed. And actually at the peak, in the, I guess it was in the early 80s or late 70s, we sometimes at Livermore had up to 5 design efforts going on at any one moment in time, okay? That all came to an absolute halt in 1992, because you can't design new weapons if you're not going to test them. Nobody's going to believe that the old phrase of an admiral's test, right? it has, the admiral wants to see the thing work. So, so what we decided in the mid-90s as a nation was to embark on a grand experiment. And by the way, it's an experiment that we really can't prove. So I guess it's in a proper way, it's not falsifiable, okay? But nevertheless, it's a grand experiment. And here's the experiment. The experiment is that if I could, instead of doing underground nuclear testing, if I could actually understand the science of what happens inside a nuclear weapon, science in the Greek sense of the term, knowledge, I really knew the physics and chemistry and everything, if I knew what was going on inside a nuclear weapon, which, by the way, up to this point, we really didn't, and I'll say more about that in a minute, then I could substitute that all the knowledge and experience that I had acquired through 2 or 3 decades of underground nuclear testing, and actually earlier above ground nuclear testing, I could substitute for that with models, simulation, and an experiment, very importantly, and a cadre of people who understood how weapons worked. Now you might say, how the heck could we have gone through the entire Cold War without really knowing how weapons worked? Well, actually, we knew how they worked, right? I mean, the basic physics was certainly understood. In fact, actually very sophisticated physics. And we had models. The problem was that there were big fudge factors built into these models because we didn't really have all the physics understood. So what would happen is we would have a model for a particular design. We'd do an underground test. And someone would go, well, look at that. The yield was this much instead of that much, right? Why is that? Well, we don't know. So we'll put a fudge factor in, right? So we had a lot of codes that were tuned to particular weapons. Actually, we still have that. But nevertheless, the idea is that if I can start to do experiments at the laboratory scale and do very, very high performance simulations, that I can take that uncertainty, all those fudge factors, that empiricism that existed when we did underground nuclear testing, and turn it into science. And then that would enable us to do some of the things we want to do with the nuclear stockpile in the absence of testing. Because the nuclear stockpile, as I said, was designed for maybe a 10 to 15-year lifetime or so. I mean, some of these weapons are 50 years old. So there's questions like aging of materials, right? And then the other thing is, these weapons were often built without any safety or security features built into them. We didn't care. The whole thing that mattered was the military requirement. It had to provide this much yield when we told it to. And whether or not it was what's called multi-point safe or one-point safe, in other words, if somebody fired a round through it, would it go off, right? That should worry you. And, or if somebody got their hands on it illicitly, would they be able to set it off? A lot of those features, I mean, we knew we wanted to put those features in. If you look at the history going back into the 70s, but the problem is every time you put those features in, there's a trade, usually in weight, and that weight turns into yield, right? Or throw weight, or the distance you can send it, right? So these things, at the end of the day, in those days, the trade was always in favor of the military requirement. And so these things didn't happen the way we would have liked to. They did happen sometimes. So we know as we go through what are called life extension programs, because these things are old and they have to sometimes be rebuilt, that we want to put in features into these systems that make them safer and more secure. Well, we're now modifying the system, okay? And so how do I know that when I modify that system, that the thing is still going to ultimately do what it does, what we say it's going to do, without taking it out to Nevada test site and blowing it up? And so that's what this grand experiment is all about, okay? And it's really what occupies a big, big part of the laboratory, of all 3 laboratories. Let's see, at my lab, it's probably close to $800 million a year. At Sandia, it's probably $1 billion. And at Los Alamos, it's probably close to $1 billion a year as well. Okay, just engaging in these kinds of activities, right? There's a lot of science that gets done. I mean, for example, one question is plutonium. How does it age? I mean, remember, plutonium is radioactive. It's not very hot, right? But nevertheless, it's radioactive. What does plutonium look like after it's been cast for 50 years? What are its material properties, right? So okay, so how do I test that? Well, I'm not going to wait around 50 years. So you have to come up with ways to do accelerated aging. Well, how do you do that? And it's this combination of experiment and model. There's a lot of things we do at the lab to work these issues. It also requires a lot of experimental facilities. One of the big concerns that all of us have, so we have these models. And the worry you have is that if you have models in the absence of experimental data, then they become writ from above, right? They become holy writ. And over time, they will, they'll take on a life of their own, and no one will really know if they're actually right or not. Let me make a point. So we have seven weapons in the stockpile today. We're trying to compress it down to 5. Okay, 2 air breathing, 3 reentry. Okay, one of them is actually going through a life extension program now. It's called the W-76. It's actually a Navy Trident system. It's just going through a life extension program now. It will go through another one around the 2040 timeframe. That's on the calendar. Okay, the people who will do that life extension program in 2040 will have been trained by people who themselves will have been trained by people who never conducted an underground nuclear test. Okay, so the fear that you have is that these models, these computer codes, right? They become, we'll be hiring people and we'll sit them down, we'll have them do simulation after simulation, and before you know it, you actually believe this stuff actually is right. When it really isn't. And so you have to do experiments to find out what that means. So at Los Alamos, for example, they have something called DART, and don't ask me, dual axis radiographic something. And what it really does is it looks at the implosion of a primary. They don't use plutonium, good. They don't use plutonium in it, they use a simulated material, but what they're really looking for is to see if the implosion under various circumstances, different kinds of high explosives, different kinds of firing sets, actually gives you the kind of system, the kind of implosion you want. Okay, we've never had this capability before. I mean, remember, all we were doing was underground nuclear tests, right? We had a lot of sensors downhole when we did these tests. They lasted about a microsecond, okay, because when it blew up, the sensors went with it. But nevertheless, but that's how we collected data. Now we're collecting data at a laboratory scale. We have a high explosive facility. This is actually out of Livermore, where we design new high explosives, and we test their capabilities, their qualities, how they age with time, and all that sort of stuff. All 3 laboratories have absolutely the cutting edge in high performance computing, and I'll say a little bit about that later at Livermore. But all 3 labs have. It's modeling and simulation, but it is very, very, very high performance modeling and simulation. It's 3-dimensional hydrodynamics with turbulence, right? It's pretty sophisticated. And then at Livermore, we also have the National Ignition Facility. So let me say about what the National Ignition Facility is all about. This is actually one of the biggest damn buildings I've ever seen in my life. It's actually several football fields in size. And it's 192 lasers that are all aimed at a target about this big, maybe about half a centimeter or so. And the idea behind it is to force an implosion in the laboratory that we can then use to collect data. And what it allows us really to do is to collect data at the temperatures and pressures and densities and strain rates that occur inside a nuclear weapon that you can't get anywhere else or any other way. And it costs a country like $3 billion to build this thing. But nevertheless, what it allows you to do is to replicate conditions in the lab that heretofore we only had inside a nuclear weapon. And in fact, we couldn't collect with diagnostics and sensors the kind of information we can here. So you can imagine the things you do here. You can collect equation of state data on plutonium. You can do a lot of stuff associated with fusion, deuterium-tritium reactions. There's a lot of things we can do here that you just can't get anywhere else in the country. We have the biggest computer. Actually, right now, Livermore has the world's fastest computer. That will probably change this month. I can't announce it, but I'm pretty sure we'll be number 2 after this month. I'll tell you, it irritates the crap out of me. But nevertheless, and you know it's because we got some faulty boards. I won't tell you who the vendor was. But anyway, but nevertheless, that's okay. Being number 2 is pretty good. We actually are right now at 16.3 sustained petaflops. Okay, we run, and by the way, the other point to be made here, when I talked about computing as being the intellectual electricity of the laboratory, the other point to be made is we don't throw our old computers away, right? So the Blue Gene, I think it was the Blue Gene P system that came before this, was around 500 teraflops. We still got that, right? And we have, we probably have, this is the biggest by far, we probably have another 4 or 5 petaflops in computing capacity at the laboratory that we use for a wide variety of problems. In fact, I'll say something more about some of those problems later on. But nevertheless, what we do with these computers is we try to simulate what happens inside an operating nuclear weapon. That's what we do. We run simulations at very, 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 sub-millimeter scales because we're catching turbulence at a very, very fine level and trying to understand what we can so we can get rid of those fudge factors in the codes that I was talking about before, which, by the way, are still in the codes. We actually eliminated one fudge factor that accounted for almost a factor of 2 in yield. Almost a factor of 2 we eliminated just 2 years ago with this and with NIF. And enough said about that. But we don't just do nuclear weapons at the laboratories. We don't just do nuclear weapons. As I said before, we actually apply these capabilities to a wide variety of problems. So, as I said, we do this with computation is ubiquitous at the laboratory. We do a lot of engineering, but at the end of the day, it's all about basic science. So let me just talk about what those might be. Just as an aside, so this is sort of how our budget is split. To give you a sense, about 60% of our work is stockpile, and about 40% of our work is other national security stuff. If you were to go to Sandia, it's closer to 50-50. And if you were to go to Los Alamos, I think it's probably more like 65-35. But we all have a lot of effort that we put into other national security work, right? But here's the really interesting thing about this. This weapon was designed it was designed entirely on a computer, okay? So this weapon was designed in such a way that it met all the mass properties that you needed to have to allow it to use existing guidance kits, right, on current munitions. And the first time a unit was actually built and taken to the field was for an acceptance test. So there was for those of you familiar with the normal process, there was no developmental test in engineering, none of that. It was all done on a computer. This thing went from view graph to acceptance testing in 9 months. Now, the normal development cycle in the Pentagon would have been at least 5 years. And in fact, this actually got deployed to Afghanistan in 11 months. And what was interesting was what the long pole in the tent, there was 2 long poles in the tent. The first was the Air Force does something they have to do to make sure that it actually flies the way we say it's going to fly on the F-15. So they had to go through that testing. That took about a couple of months. And then the other long pole in the tent was getting the Pentagon acquisition system to respond at the same level, at the same speed that we were able to respond to with deploying the system. Actually, that would have been impossible had it not been the fact that there was a war going on. So anyway, we're very proud of this, and it's something, that's really it's saving our troops' lives overseas. This is another example of something that's actually is deployed today. It's actually looking for not roadside bombs, but bombs embedded in the ground. Now, for those of you who understand the problem, if you thought about the problem a little bit, there's been a lot of people who do things with called ground penetrating radars. This idea has been around for 15 years. The problem is that ground penetrating radars will alarm on anything, right? So there's any significant change in density will cause an alarm. So if it's a beer can buried in the road, it will cause an alarm. And what you end up doing with ground penetrating radars is every few feet you get someone out there digging up a hole to find out what's in there, right? And you can't do this. This actually has a supercomputer in the back of the van. And what it does is it actually images, it's actually it's not really a CT imager, I wouldn't call it that, but it actually has multiple beams and it images what's underground. So the operator can discriminate between a beer can and a landmine or a bomb. And by the way, you can do this, I believe, at 15 kilometers an hour. So you can actually run this down the road pretty fast. Okay? And so this is actually deployed today, I believe. And then finally, I'll be remiss if we don't talk about lasers. I mentioned the National Ignition Facility. You know, one of the old jokes in the community is that Lawrence Livermore, LLNL means lasers, lasers, nothing but lasers. Right? and it's, and you know, we are almost certainly the global center of excellence for high energy and high power laser systems. I mean, various forms of them have been developed at the laboratory. We're currently working on a new system. It's a diode pump system, diode pumped alkali laser that actually for the first time has the capacity to get kind of megawatt class laser power out of something the size of that desk, which would really be a game changer. We do a lot of work in nuclear nonproliferation. As I said, nuclear security is a big part of our mission space. And you know, NNSA actually has, as part of its mission, nuclear nonproliferation. So Livermore is so the way it divides up is that Los Alamos and Sandia are primarily focused on space-based nuclear detection systems. So the systems we deploy on satellites to detect whether an above-ground test has occurred are deployed by mainly LANL and Sandia. Livermore is much more focused on seismic explosion monitoring. And there's a lot of real hard problems there because, you know, one of the concerns is particularly if we go into a comprehensive test ban treaty, one of the concerns is that what is the lowest yield level that someone can test to where they still get useful information regarding nuclear weapons design? Okay, and it turns out that it's a pretty low level. I won't tell you what it is, but it's a pretty low level. And then are there ways where the bad guys, or the people who are trying to avoid detection of a test or of a development program, are the ways that they can evade detection? So that it turns out that there are things that can be done, and so that reduces the detection threshold even more. Well, at some point you get to the place where it's hard to distinguish a nuclear explosion from an earthquake or a mine collapse, which happen all the time apparently. I hope nobody's in them, but happen all the time. I mean, a wide variety of events. There's a whole kinds of seismic events that happen all the time at these levels, and you have to distinguish them, okay? Well, the way you have to do that ultimately is develop a three-dimensional model of the Earth. So how would you do that? One way to do that, particularly say Iran. So this is a picture of Iran, right? This actually shows seismic wave propagations from Iran. It turns out the geology there is extraordinarily complex. There's two crustal plates that kind of come together there, and it's just a hard place to detect. North Korea, easy, but here, tough. And so what you have to do is create a three-dimensional model. Well, the way you do that is you look at seismic sources. You look at mine collapses. You look at earthquakes. And then you look at all this information you have and you try to reconstruct, this really is CT imaging, you try to reconstruct a three-dimensional seismic picture of the region. That is a supercomputer problem if there ever was one, believe me. In fact, actually, our computers today are not powerful, the petaflops scale are really not powerful to do this at the level we would like. It really requires exaflop scale computing. So, but nevertheless, that is something we do. I mean, just to show you one result here, you know, one of the problems you have is when there's an underground test, where did it happen? Because under the IAEA rules, if there's an underground nuclear test, if you're a signatory, then you have, after a certain period of time, you can parachute in, and you can do core sampling of the Earth to find out what happened, right? That's part of the rules. But you only have like a square kilometer to do that in. So if you can't detect the explosion site within a square kilometer, you're kind of out of luck, right? Or you're guessing. So the trick here is to try to get things into, a small area so you can actually enforce the rules. But that's a very, very high performance computing issue. We do a lot of sensors work. I won't say much about this. One of the reasons we are really good at, L3 labs, one of the reasons L3 labs are very, very good at sensors is because we used to do underground nuclear tests. And when we did underground nuclear tests, you had to collect a lot of data very fast, right? And so signal processing, especially toward the end of the nuclear testing period, there was a lot of work done on digital signal processing. A lot of the stuff was analog prior to that, but there was a lot of work done on digital signal processing. And that skill set, of course, translates to a wide variety of applications. So we use that today on a wide variety of deployed capabilities. Let me talk a little bit about biosciences, because people tend to be surprised about biosciences. All 3 labs have programs in biosciences. Livermore's is the biggest. Sandia has a very big program as well. Los Alamos, much smaller. So how did the labs get into this business? Well, in the 1950s and 60s, we were all asked to look into the effects of radiation on biological systems. Obvious thing to worry about if you're a nuclear weapons laboratory. Well, of course, that happened right around the time that the DNA revolution was taking off. And of course, the primary damage mechanism of radiation in cells is radiation to DNA, right? So what happened was the laboratories, and certainly my laboratory, got really, really, really good at understanding DNA science, okay? So they developed a lot of capabilities aimed at that. It actually led to the Human Genome Project. That actually originated at Los Alamos and at Livermore. Mainly because we had big computers. We actually invented chromosome painting. Actually, this is actually another slight management irritation, because it turns out that the patent is about to run out. And therefore, a big chunk of my licensing revenue is going away next year, 2013. Kind of irritating. But we collect a lot on that. And then now we're all about high performance simulations. By the way, one of the other things, let me make a point here. So I mentioned earlier, we make a lot of investments in internal research and development capabilities because we try to anticipate the needs of the nation. So in the 1990s, Sandia and Livermore invested through their own internal resources into the idea of detection of aerosolized pathogens, okay? Like anthrax or plague or that sort of thing. And they had developed a prototype system. And so when October of 2001 happened and the anthrax letters hit, the only capability in the country that existed to deploy to at least warn whether an attack was occurring on the country was technology that had been developed internally by the national labs. So I will tell you that in August of 2011, the number of people in this country who cared about bioterrorism and biodefense, you could probably have counted on the fingers of 2 hands. I was one of them. I worked on it separately. It was a very, very small community of people. On November of 2001, believe me, there was a lot of people who worried about this, right? And you can't, if you don't have that capacity to make those kinds of investments and build capability, you just don't turn this stuff on like a step function, right? You just can't say, oh, I've got a biodefense problem, what should I do, right? So in 2002, actually, initially the White House and then DHS ended up deploying this capability to over 30 cities across the country. And in fact, it exists today. If you were to go, those of you, if you're out at GW downtown, if you happen to walk out to the mall, you know what the carousel is on the mall? Everybody know what that is? Actually, if you look just a little bit to the right, you'll see something that looks like a power supply box. That's actually what's called a BioWatch system. That's actually a sensor. There's a whole bunch of them deployed all over, certainly in Washington, D.C. So that capability came about simply because the national laboratories came to the conclusion that this was a problem that was going to come around and they better be ready for it. A lot of biosciences, there's an awful lot of wet biology today that goes on, absolutely. But an awful lot about biosciences today is information science. And I got the world's biggest computer, so I can do stuff, right, that nobody else can do. And so we do, in fact, actually, let me just go forward here. So one of the problems we worked on at the laboratory was developing an array. This array actually detects every known human pathogen. Every known human pathogen. Okay? That's been sequenced, which I think is all of them. Okay? In fact, even some of their nearest neighbors. And so if you think about it, so how do we do that? We do that by doing DNA matching. Okay? But think about the combinatorial problem associated with that, okay? Because what you're doing is you're looking for sequences of DNA on a particular organism that identify that organism, but in reality, there are very similar sequences like that on probably dozens of other organisms. So you've got to design an array in such a way that you do this so that you don't get any, so that there are no confusers. So that when you say that there is plague, or a particular virus, that is what is on there, and it's not a false positive, right? So, again, the combinatorial problem attached to doing this could only be done with a very, 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 very big computer. And that's how it was done. Actually, it's done on a computer that's not well suited for this problem. I'll just make a point. The computers that I have are are mainly suited best for problems that deal with hydrodynamics, large partial differential equations, okay? Big linear algebra problems. This is actually an integer arithmetic problem, and it's just something but it's a big one, a really, really big one. And so it's kind of like shoving a round peg into a square hole, but we made it work. And then the other thing we do a lot of is computational drug design. So this is really a big push for us. One of the problems in this country, certainly in biodefense, is that there's really nobody in charge. And again, that sort of points up another value of the national laboratories, I think. And that is that we end up cobbling together what we call virtual programs, okay? So if you were to ask who's in charge of biodefense in the United States today, there is no answer. The National Institutes of Health got a piece of it. The Department of Homeland Security has a piece of it. The Defense Department has a piece of it. FDA has a piece of it. USDA has a piece of it. VA has a piece of it. So everybody's got a little piece. There is no White House coordination at all. I can tell you for sure, there's no White House coordination at all that happens on this, right? And so if you look at it, the real integration of these capabilities, for a lot of it, not all of it, occurs at the national laboratories, mainly at Livermore and Sandia. Because we are the guys we got a little program at DOD, we got a little program at FDA, we got a little program at DHS, and they're all kind of designed to sort of fill in this sort of bigger picture. Okay, that's what we're all about. So one of the things so the other thing about high performance computing that I'll point out is that in high performance computing, I could have brought a chart that showed how high performance computing has grown over the last several decades. And it kind of looks like a Moore's law. It's actually not, but it's a different power law. But it grows with time, right? It actually has a dog leg in it when the stockpile stewardship program started. But nevertheless, it is an inexorable rise in computing capacity from teraflop to many teraflops to hundreds of teraflops to petaflops, right? The reason I don't like to show that chart is that what it doesn't capture is the fact that every once in a while you get to a certain place and you can do qualitatively new kinds of problems that you couldn't do before. You can start thinking about things in a way that you couldn't think about. You can start asking questions that would not have occurred to you to even ask before. So for example, when we had sort of teraflop kind of computing capacity, it was one of the main things, one of the big things we did and other labs did was do crystallographic studies of proteins, right? So you have very, very complex crystallographic patterns, and you look at that and you sort of figure out, actually it's also a hard combinatorial problem, but you sort of figure out what the crystal structure of the protein looks like and what you think, and therefore you try to derive what its structure might look like in solution, okay? Now, over time, as the computers got faster, we could do that faster. But eventually you got to the point where someone realized that, I could start modeling these proteins in solution. In solution. So that's a hard problem, right? Because now I have a protein that's moving around, it's interacting with a solvent that has a pH, all those sorts of things. Very hard problem, okay? And so we've been able to do that now for maybe a decade, okay? And then a few years ago, we got to the point when we got to hundreds of teraflops, where we went, you know what? I can start docking small molecules onto these proteins in solution and trying to get affinities. Okay, I can start to do that. And oh, by the way, when I get up to kind of hundreds of teraflops, I can do the full quantum mechanical calculation. Well, it's not de novo, but it's nevertheless a pretty big, you can do this using quantum mechanics, right? This is a big, big deal, okay? So now what I can do is I can look at pathogens, the genome, things I want to interfere with, proteins on a pathogen that I want to interfere with, and I can invent small molecules called new molecular entities in the parlance of the trade, and see what works. Now, and here's the cool part, okay? The cool part is that I can also start to now ask the question, how do those small molecular entities interact with the human proteome? Okay? Because so I'm now at the point where I can start asking the question, not only can I see what interferes with the function of a protein on a pathogen, I can also start to ask the question, is this going to interfere with the function of a protein that I don't want it to interfere with? So believe me, we're a long ways away from doing this full scale. This is a hard problem. But we can start to ask questions about whether or not this new molecular entity is likely to cause kidney damage, or is likely to cause a liver problem, or something like that, right? You can do all of this on a computer. And so what you're capable of doing is taking a drug development timeline, which over the entire course, including clinical trials, can run you 15 years. We still do not have a cure for SARS, which struck in 2003, I think, right? We still don't have anything for that, right? It's a 15-year timeline. You can now start to squish that, right, dramatically. And what we're finding is things that would take 2 or 3 years to do in terms of drug discovery can now be done in months. By the way, this does not eliminate the need for wet biology. Okay, you have to, because look, computer codes, to get back to an earlier point, computer codes are just that, they're computer codes, right? And we're sure as heck not going to introduce these things into people or animals, right, without doing some testing, right? So, but what it does allow you to do is to do importance sampling. You can really reduce the amount of stuff that you work on and then focus on those things. By the way, the other thing we can do, it's not on the chart, is we can do microdosing. We also have extraordinarily sensitive instruments at the laboratory. And so we can now put in by factors of 100 or so, subclinical doses into people of some of these ideas, and we can start to test out the pharmacokinetics. We can see where they end up in the body, that sort of thing. This is actually FDA approves, believe it or not, this is an approved process by FDA, right? And that's actually turning into a bit of a cottage industry. A number of other places around the country. For a while, Livermore was the only place that could do this. Now a few other places are starting to pick up on it as well. So you really, again, you're at a point here where these capabilities that, oddly enough, were originally invested in for the nuclear weapons program, and that's actually why they were getting invested in. That's why we get them, are being used for a very, very wide variety of problems that affect national security. So with that, one other thing I'll point out. So all 3 laboratories have also operational capabilities. We have stuff that operate 24/7. So for example, at Livermore, we have the national, so when Deepwater Horizon was one, but perhaps more interesting was the Fukushima event. So all those plots you saw in the news of the plume flying across the Pacific, that was us, right? And we do that for everybody. So we do that for whenever, it was originally developed after 3 Mile Island, right, because of the concerns about atmospheric releases of radiation. Actually, I think Fukushima was the first time it actually ever been really used for radiation release since. I think that's right. Maybe Chernobyl. And then, but we use it for all kinds of things. If there's a big tire fire in the Beltway, or or people are concerned about what would happen if there was an anthrax release in, pick one, Chicago, Seattle. This is the model that the nation uses to figure that out. Also of note in Fukushima was our Forensic Science Center. We actually have a joint arrangement with the FBI. We do, not surprisingly, and again, this goes back to our legacy from nuclear testing days. We're really, really, really good at radiochemistry. And we're also good at bioforensics and chem forensics. In fact, we're the only lab in the country that can do all three. But on the radiochemistry, so with Fukushima, we started getting samples from Fukushima because, in part to validate these models, and both us and Los Alamos were running 24/7 for several weeks. I mean, those people were getting run ragged. And even in Hurricane Sandy, when we have something called the Homeland, this is actually we do for the National Guard, we were called into play, and those guys were operating, pretty much, for about 3 days running straight, trying to figure out, what was the impact of the flooding in New York City. So that's what we do. And so what I tried to do was give you a picture. I mean, we do a lot more stuff. We do work in energy. I didn't talk about that. We do work in material science. Didn't talk about that. A lot of things. But what I tried to do in the time I had was to give you a sense of sort of the breadth of activity that occurs, certainly at Livermore, because that's where I am, but actually occurs at Sandia and Los Alamos. And again, it's really a matter of scale. We have the world's biggest computers. We have the world's biggest lasers. We have the world's best sensor technology. But actually, more importantly than anything, we have some of the very best people. Both Los Alamos and Livermore remain destinations for people with degrees in computer. I mean, if you want to work in high-performance computing these days, you go to Livermore or you go to Los Alamos. That's where the action is. If you want to work in material science, right, you come to Livermore. If you want to work on plutonium science, you go to Los Alamos. Actinide science, you go to Los Alamos, right? If you are a hot engineer, you go to work at Sandia because you will get to work on absolutely the coolest problems that anybody gets to work on. And we attract those people. And that's really the strength of the laboratories. I got 7,000 people at my lab. Los Alamos is about 10, or about 8. Sandia is about 10. That kind of critical mass, you just can't get anywhere else. So with that, I'll open it up for questions. Surely you have questions.
I have one.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, ask people to use the mics so we pick it up on the video feed we're doing.
Is this on?
It's on.
So many of the modeling tools that you've developed now have potential applications and already realized applications in non-classified areas.
Right.
Are your scientists able to freely share their findings internally, and how do you handle the problem of an external party wishing to have access to the models?
So, well, it depends on the model. I can tell you right now, if it's a nuclear weapons model, we don't let those go out. No, we actually, a lot of our models are actually in broad use today. Actually, it was interesting. Ash Carter, when he was the Undersecretary for AT&L in the Pentagon, actually in this administration, did a study, and I think 95% of all unclassified structural computing done in the Department of Defense, and 100% of the classified stuff was done using DOE codes, right? So, for example, we have a code called Dyna3D that's basically, it's used for automobile crash simulations. It's used by TSA for, actually we do it for TSA to look at the vulnerability of aircraft, different explosive charges. We at our laboratory, we are the explosive center of excellence for the country. So all of the energetics codes that the Department of Defense uses, or commercial industry uses, we do the testing, they have their origins with us. As an aside, TSA again comes to us with all these unconventional explosives that they're facing, and we do a lot of work in that area for TSA. But yeah, commercial, there's a lot of this computational software has been commercialized by, generally by other people and deployed to in the broader interests of the nation. Now, some of it's, if it's like ITAR or something like that, I guess we would probably have to worry about that. But, most of this stuff is just really good physics. Frank?
Parney, more out of for a fascinating talk. More out of curiosity, do you have any weapons designers still around, and how are you using them as mentors to teach the next generation? Because that's a significant gap and concern from a national security standpoint. So is there a way to pool it with the other labs?
Yeah,
Just curiosity.
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting. Yes, we still have people at the labs who were involved in underground nuclear testing. And we still actually have quite a few retirees who, in fact, I have one guy at the lab. We just gave him an award who was there who was one of the original, he was there in 1952. He's pretty old. But he was, and he's still there, he's active. Kind of a pain in the ass, actually. But he's, I mean, he's kind of an irascible guy, but nevertheless, but really good. And he's still involved in energy storage issues and stuff like that for us. That's a big problem. You know, the way you do that is you have you create groups of people who are, okay, let me back up. So one of my responsibilities every year, the director of Los Alamos and the director of Sandia have the same responsibility, and this is a congressionally mandated responsibility, is we have to sign out a letter every year on the reliability of the stockpile. And we have to assert whether or not we think underground testing is required again, okay? I mean, there's a lot of interesting questions surrounding that, but so far we have never had to say that. But in order to, there's actually a whole process that gets me to signing that letter. So I have a team of people that are associated not just with every weapon that Livermore is responsible for. We're responsible for four, okay? Well, 3.5 kind of. And then the Los Alamos, I also have people assigned to look at Los Alamos systems. And Los Alamos does the same for their systems and for us. And then Sandia does it for all the non-nuclear components. Actually, the non-nuclear part of this is a lot easier because you can test the hell out of that, right? You know, and they do, right? So what we do is we assign those teams, and they basically sit at the feet of the people who actually were the people involved in the design of those weapons, or were closely involved with that. And they are just trained to understand the codes, understand the shortcomings. Every one of these systems has a fairly rich history of underground testing. Some of them didn't work. Some of them failed. There were fizzles, you know. And so we spend a lot of our time trying to understand, you know, now that we have good codes and good computers and we have a lot more science than we used to have, we spend time going back and looking at the old underground tests and see if there's things that we can understand better about them that we didn't understand before. But again, this is part of this larger hypothesis that, you know, by understanding the fundamental science and at the same time having experiments that challenge those hypotheses, that science. I mean, if you don't have experiments that sample the physics that's relevant and are constantly stressing these codes, then you run, in my view, a huge risk, right? So that's part of it. And then the other part of it is that Los Alamos and Livermore kind of compete with one another. Actually, we have very different philosophies toward weapons reliability. Okay, they are much more empirically based than we are. We are much more model-based than they are. It's actually a good, you know, so we tend to come at it from different ways, and it's a very good approach. And so, and nobody from Livermore wants to look stupid in front of a guy from Los Alamos, and nobody from Los Alamos wants to look stupid. It does happen in front of a guy from Livermore. No, it never happens the other way around. So there's that going on, you know, too. But I mean, you're raising a point that we just don't know, right? I mean, part of this is how much are we going to change the weapons? You know, the easiest thing to say would be, why don't I just build them from the same damn blueprint I did before, okay? Well, there's several problems with that. First of all, you're now designing in all the design flaws that we have now identified into these systems, right? There's some of them have significant design flaws. That's number one. Number two, you're not putting in the surety features, safety and security features that you would like to put in. You're just putting us back into the 70s, right? But number three, and perhaps most subtle but most important, is you really don't know if you're building them the same way as you did before. You know, there's a famous story about the Brits. When the Brits took on the Polaris system, we had shut down our Polaris production line, and so we gave them the blueprints for Polaris, right? And the first couple of shots they did failed. It's the same damn missile, right? What happened? Well, it turned out that there was an aluminum alloy, Alcoa, I'll make up the number, 2304, which they ordered from Alcoa. It's the same Alcoa 2304 that had been on the last one. But guess what? The production process had changed. Who knew? Until the thing blew up, right? So you can never be certain. And so actually the, what we call certification, the certification process you go, if you're just doing the same design, is every bit as complex as if you had a new design. So these are really hard problems.
I guess it's my turn. There's a time in the 10 or 15 years ago, I think it's under the Clinton administration, there are a lot of discussion about dual-use laboratory, national lab under DOE. And at one time, almost every lab is being pushed, like Sandia was pushed, into developing, since you're heavily involved in science, there's a potential dual use for civilian energy applications and things like this. After 9/11, I guess there's a shrinkage of focusing 3 labs into defense, security, and the rest of the labs going into more dual use. Sandia is far more dual use today than you guys.
Right, they're about half and half.
Right, and is there, do you see, let's say, from yesterday's election results, seeing the future, do you see any shift, or there's a time will come that you get back into dual use as a national asset, or just focusing on purely weapons?
No, so we all, as I said, 40% of my work is not weapons-related work. We are very focused on doing non-weapons work. But you're actually highlighting an interesting point. There is always this debate that goes on about whether we should stick to our knitting and just stick to nuclear weapons, or we should expand the activities that we do. The first remark I'd make is we've already done that, right? So I am a big part, for example, of the cybersecurity ecosystem. I'm a big part of the biodefense ecosystem. Sandia is a big part of, actually both of those, cyber defense and biosecurity. The question that comes up is to what degree does this other work interfere with your core mission, which is nuclear weapons? And I think the best response is, first of all, it doesn't. The people who are working on these activities tend not to be working on nuclear. I mean, my bioscientists, believe me, well, actually, that's not strictly true. I mean, the computer scientists certainly could be working on nuclear weapons. In fact, actually, that's one of the strengths, is that if I get someone who's working bioinformatics, and then 3 years later, they go to, we're very heavily matrixed. They end up working on a weapons program or on a material science program. They now bring that richness of experience to those activities that they wouldn't have gotten any other way, right? And actually, again, that gets back to that multidisciplinary, creativity and innovation that you get. Frankly, a lot of this work is critical for us being able to attract the very best and brightest. It's very hard to get someone out of grad school and say, I want you to work on the W-78, which is it's one of the systems on top of the Minuteman, right? It's much easier if I say, how would you like to do some really cool, multi-scale materials modeling, right? And oh, by the way, every once in a while, we're going to ask you to do nuclear weapons work. Maybe more than he thought, but nevertheless, no, the point is that, and NNSA will say the same thing. This work that we do outside of the weapons program it's core to our mission. I mean, I showed you the mission statement from Livermore. It actually talks about our ability, and we didn't write that, as I said, deploying your capabilities for the broader national security space. And if we stop doing that, I think it would be a tragedy. And frankly, I think it would be a dereliction of duty on my part and the part of the other 2 lab directors if we permitted that to happen.
Both Livermore and Los Alamos used to be part of, and maybe still are, part of the University of California.
Uh-huh.
Is that still the case? And could you describe the nature of the relationship?
Sure. So up until, for Livermore, it was about, I guess, 5 or 6 years ago, maybe 7 years ago. And Los Alamos was about maybe 8 or 9 years ago. We were both managed by UC, by University of California. in part because of problems that were going on at Los Alamos at the time. Wen Ho Lee, you might have remembered that there was a hard drive that was found in some hooker's trailer or something. I mean, it was. I forget the details, but anyway, there was, there was a lot of incidents that occurred, and the decision was made by then DOE to bring in new management. So and Los Alamos was the first one that was competed. So there was a University of California-led team, but it also included Bechtel and I think URS and a few other private sector companies. Livermore was competed a couple of years later, same team, but with Battelle added. And so that's how we're structured right now. So in the old days, UC basically did this as, in fact, they still do. UC does this as part of their national mission. They do this as part of their national service mission. And so the chairman of my board is Norm Pattis. The chairman of Los Alamos we have the same board, by the way. The chairman of the board is Norm Pattis, who is a University of California regent. And they have, their responsibility is, for example, they get to decide who's the new director. So they were the ones who decided that I'd be the new director. They did the same thing at Los Alamos. But Bechtel in particular and others bring to the table some operational capabilities that, at least the view was that UC had not been able to bring to the table. And so that's how that works. I mean, the other net result of this was that in order to get those guys involved, the fee went up. So UC's fee was, I'm guessing it was like around $25 million, which they turned right back into the lab, right? Now the fee is around, in my case, around 50 million. For Los Alamos, I think it's around 80 or something like that. And the UC portion of that fee, which is probably about half of it, is now used it's actually put back into the labs for collaborative work with the University of California system. So we do a lot of collaborative work with Berkeley and Davis and those guys. But the net result was to raise the fee. And our top line didn't change, just so you know, okay? And then the other impact of it we had, at least at Livermore, was, for example, things like prior to that, in our healthcare plan, and this sounds ridiculous, but actually it's a big deal, was part of the larger UC healthcare. So we were negotiating with like a zillion other people. We had a great, all of a sudden now I'm a 7,000 person LLC, and our negotiating power shrank. So, and there's some pension issues and a lot of other things, but the net result, so that's sort of the current arrangement.
Well, I think I want to thank Parney because it's getting a little late. I thought maybe we could stop, and those of you who want to talk with them can talk outside. As you witnessed here, Parney has been serving our nation at the highest level, and it's great to mention that to get to that level and to be a significant and important player at the national level, you need the kind of science and technology background that he has demonstrated here. A vast, you could see he shared his, the breadth and depth of his knowledge with us tonight, from biological sciences all the way to physical sciences, to be a great generalist, which we really probably don't do as good a job in the universities to deliver to the nation. But every now and then you get a talent, and Parney is one of those who has served the scientific community as well as the nation at the highest level, the policy levels, so well. It's a tradition with GW apparently, because if you remember one of his first earlier slides, when he talked about the founders of the Lawrence Livermore National Labs, he mentioned Lawrence and he mentioned Edward Teller. And Edward Teller was a faculty member at GW just before he went and started the Lawrence Livermore National Labs. George Gamow came to GW on one condition, that he could bring one major scientist with him, and that was Edward Teller. Like the weapon designer that is a pain in a certain part of the physiology, that Parney has very succinctly named in his various parts of the talk, Edward Teller apparently had the same effect on various people. But he spent a great deal of his talent on improving the defense of this nation. And so we are just happy to have another GW person in charge because we know we're safer, right? Okay. Thank you very much for coming and listening, and I hope you participate in the other events we have planned for you, and enjoy some of the things that are still left out there, drinks and food.